So hi everyone, my name is Jim Colliander. I was previously at the University of Toronto and had an idea that led to the creation of Crowdmark. And now I'm at the University of British Columbia, and I'm really happy to be here to talk with you a little bit about Crowdmark and the relationship that it has to grading workflows. But I also want to put it in the context, the larger context of the education system and artificial intelligence and significant decisions that we have to make, I think, as a global entity on what we're going to do about education in the era of artificial intelligence. So I want to make some general remarks in that direction and then tell you a little bit about how Crowdmark fits into that conversation. The first thing, it's not switching the way I expected. Now it's working. So I want to highlight the date, June 17th, 1948. So that's just about 75 years ago, almost to the day. John Bardeen and Walter Brattain patented the transistor. There were others that were involved at Bell Labs in trying to build the transistor, such as William Shockley, who just a few days after, on June 26th, patented the semiconductor or junction style transistor. And in the next month, Claude Shannon published this work. And this work is quite remarkable. If you were to scroll down to the bottom, he references someone named Tukey, who described a way to quantify information using a very interesting word called a bit. So the first notion of quantifying information in this bit-like way of counting, that's an invention of Claude Shannon. And that invention, the word bit, was Tukey's, but it first appeared in this paper. So those two patents and this paper all occurred almost to the day, 75 years ago. And I just want to imagine what it might have been like to be at that place, 436 West Avenue in Manhattan, looking out at the future, knowing that the era of vacuum tubes that had started some of the telephonic revolution was being changed with these semiconductor devices that could be produced at scale. And then also understanding these abstractions of the concept of communication and information and the vision that those people had working together on that special spot of land in Manhattan, which if I click into, you can see where it's located. Right there, it's on the far west side of Manhattan. What was it like to be there then? Well, I think we're sort of similar. We're here on some special land, trying to imagine the future state of education. And if we invent something special, I think we should look back to Virginia's call to action and imagine the deep meaning of the land that we're on and the idea that we as humans together are collaborating. And I invite us today to think about assessment in the era of education with the same sort of time scale. What is going to happen over the next 75 years to the enterprise that we're involved in? So let me start off by pointing out that we who classify ourselves as academics, every time we do, we're making a land acknowledgement. So there's a special hero named Academus. I think of this person as kind of like Obi-Wan Kenobi. Anybody know the story of Academus? So when she was 12 years old, Helen, later Helen of Troy, was kidnapped by the Athenian king Theseus, the killer of the Minotaur. And of course, the father of Helen was pretty upset, as were her militarized brothers, Castor and Pollux. So Castor and Pollux were coming from Sparta, and they were about to wage war on Athens in order to get back their kid sister. But Academus figured out where Helen was and told Castor and Pollux how to find her without waging war on Athens. And that averted a war. Now, the king of Sparta at that time, Tyndareus, liked what Academus had done, avoided a war, and in so doing, celebrated Academus by giving Academus a special grove of beautiful olive trees that was called the Grove of Academus. Now, this was all in the mythological, heroic time, long before the time of Plato. But later, Plato came along and created a little space for people with gray hair to talk with people with less gray hair about ideas. And one of the ways that this academy that was named that because of the location in honor of Academus, they walked underneath a gate that said, let only geometers enter here. And geometry, of course, going back, is really earth measurement. So you can see these humans that are collaborating across generations are doing so with a preeminent focus on land and their time together, their collaborative interactions on land. And they celebrated logical reasoning, deduction, and thinking in a really interesting way. So if you zoom in, they have since found in the early 70s the archaeological evidence of Plato's Academy, and they found there's now an excavation site of Plato's Academy. What I think is really remarkable about the Academy is that it was a pioneering way to structure the way human beings get together to learn. It was also captured around this earth measurement concept and logical reasoning and deduction. And in this way, every time we say we are academics, we are hearkening back to that land and that person that the name was named after. And I invite us all to think about what we might invent today and maybe reflect on how the land around Pullman, Washington might be something that we want to chronicle and celebrate. Now, Plato had a really interesting view of students. So around his time, there were these people that were called sophists. What sophists were, characterized in some sense as charlatans, they were basically people that purported to have expertise, and they could deliver that expertise to students, and students would pay them for knowledge transfer. Those were the sophists. And Plato and his teacher Socrates had a different view, basically the love of knowledge rather than knowledge itself, and the idea that students were equipped with logical reasoning and thinking, and that students could discover things on their own through logical debate, interaction with others, and this tension between sophists, knowledge transferers, and philosophers, more like leaders of people who knew how to think towards their own self-discovery, emerged. Plato, like his teacher Socrates, taught through dialogue, and he had a view that the academy and its relationship to society was really a lifelong process, and he articulated in the Republic that it was vital to the success of democracies and the success of decision-making that every human being develop some knowledge and some understanding. Now, there were the usual problems. There were two women that are historically recognized as being part of the academy. The rest of it was all pretty much privileged males. And so there have been changes over time, and I'll chronicle some of those in a moment. The Latin root for education, educere, is really about leading, giving power, drawing forth, directing. It's not so much about filling with information into the mind of the student. But this education system that we're all a part of has been transforming for quite some time. I'm waiting for JavaScript. So in 1100 or so, the University of Bologna was invented. That was the first university in Europe. And then Oxford and Cambridge and Salamanca came along later. And then a whole bunch of other universities expanded. But I want to highlight a massive change with the introduction of Wilhelm von Humboldt's Berlin University, later renamed Humboldt, and his brother Alexander von Humboldt. So the Berlin University really created the concept of a graduate school, and it really defined the modern notion of a university. The first 10,000 PhDs given to Americans, pretty much, were given in Germany, following the model of the Berlin University. It wasn't until 1861 that the first PhD in the United States was delivered. That was by Yale University. But the modern version of the university in the United States was really championed in 1876 with the creation of Johns Hopkins University, which was built on the pattern of Berlin. Prior to that, it was Yale College and Harvard College. And the leaders of those colleges were on the board of governors of Johns Hopkins University. And in like 1878, Harvard College became Harvard University because of the influence of Berlin propagated through Johns Hopkins. And so you'll see this arc of change, and Johns Hopkins really played a significant role in transforming higher education in the United States of America. Also, around the time of that first PhD, the Morrill Act was founded, and the Morrill Land Grant Act created an incredible opportunity for lots of settlers to learn about education. The Morrill Act was partly driven around trying to skill people up around agriculture and mining, and not just around the whole person, not just around education as an aspirational human cultivation activity, but also an economically vital part of growing the whole system. It was also an act of settler colonial expansion. The Morrill Act granted 30,000 acres to states that were willing to build an education system, and usually those grants were on lands that were previously occupied by the indigenous people that lived on these lands beforehand. But the Morrill Land Grant Act really transformed education so that it wasn't just kind of a rich person activity for the gentlemen scholars of the time, and instead expanded the role of education to have these economic impacts. Other ways that the education system has transformed, in 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act transformed the way that intellectual property is created through federally funded research and imposed upon universities the requirement that they hold the IP and that the university is responsible for commercializing the IP. Previously, the IP was granted to the federal government, and then it was really difficult for anyone to use that invention. So there's been changes in the way that the university and its relationship to governments have evolved over time. And we've seen this proliferation of startup incubators and accelerators in the past decade, and also the emergence of online delivery of instruction. So education is completely transformed and reacting and transforming to technology. This quote, which kind of goes off the screen, is one from Socrates. Socrates was vehemently opposed to writing. After all, if we write things down on paper, we're not going to have to remember it. And since we're not going to have to remember it, we're not going to remember. And so it's going to change our relationship to someone. So you can see that Socrates also was opposed to the technological evolution. If you go back to the Apollo era, when transistors made Texas Instrument calculators proliferate circa 1975, I think it was the end of 1976, there was something like one calculator for every 9 Americans in 1976. And if you go back and you look at the literature and the math pedagogy discussions, then this is going to destroy society if people don't know how to do long division. And over time, we've seen that there's a way that the calculator has been incorporated into our instruction, incorporated into our society. You know, Virginia was saying this morning at breakfast that she had heard arguments that you can't rely on the calculator because you won't always have it with you. You know, you're not going to carry a calculator with you all the time. Well, what if you need to divide when you're at the restaurant? Well, now we have calculators in our pocket all the time, but it wasn't the devastation to education that some people thought this was bringing on. And so now we're at this era of artificial intelligence. How are we going to incorporate that? Well, I think one answer to that is we have to reflect on what the purpose of education is. Is it to fill young minds' heads with knowledge? I can do that with Wikipedia pretty easily. I can do that with Google pretty easily. Is it to cultivate a better notion of self and to integrate oneself into humanity and society, kind of the way that William von Humboldt imagined with Bildung and these other ideas that led to the creation of the Berlin University? Or is it to create conditions so that graduates can get employed in the modern economy? And if it's the last one, what will the modern economy look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? It's hard to anticipate. So I think the answers to these questions are maybe all of them with some kind of a varying emphasis. But if you look at the mission statements of all the universities, what's the mission statement of a university, Chuck?
I have no idea.
Okay, but it has 3 legs typically.
Yeah, okay.
Research, service, and teaching.
Yes.
I don't think that's as mission focused as tactical. We are tactically going to produce new knowledge through research. We are tactically going to try to improve society through service. And it is our job tactically to try to train students. But why? Why are we doing that? What's the goal? Why is knowledge transfer from one generation to the next so vital? And for me, there's this quote from Hannah Arendt that I think it's really long, but essentially what it says to me is, why do parents raise children? Why do you help children to learn to succeed as adults? It's because you believe in them, and you believe that they're going to have challenges, and that their success requires your rearing. And in a similar way, I think education is to society as parents are to their children in some sense. So we as a global education entity need to figure out how to take the next generation and prepare them for the challenges they face. And unfortunately, our generation of mostly gray-haired people and those prior to us have created some significant challenges for the next generation, maybe with some unprecedented historical gravity, such as climate change and this era of misinformation this era 75 years after the transistor. And so our job has perhaps never been more important. But we have a lot less flexibility to be innovative in our roles now because of decreasing state budgets, constraints on tuition, large class sizes, constraints, every decision being made by committee. So how do we react quickly to the circumstances that are facing us? Well, I don't have answers to all of those grand questions, but I do have some examples about how we are informed by some of these ideas in the context of Crowdmark. So for Crowdmark, our mission statement is not to boost productivity of grading. We do that in a huge way. We save tons of time, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to really promote dialogue between the instructors and their collaborators, like teaching assistants, and the students who are meant to learn. An assessment is this exchange of information, often with some sort of a grading rubric, and we are trying to transform that traditional assessment process into something that involves more dialogue, because we think that's at the heart of the education activity. But how do you dialogue with 1,000 students? So we've invented technology that allows us to do some of that dialoguing, and we see ways that artificial intelligence, natural language processing, and other recent advances in technology can build on this strategy to dialogue with more students. So I want to tell you about some recent work in this direction. So I have an ongoing collaboration with these folks. My collaborator, Caroline Junkins, is an instructor at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Driving around last night here in Pullman, it reminded me a lot, actually, of Hamilton, Ontario, where McMaster is based. So Caroline was previously a postdoc at Harvard, and she implemented some work at Harvard that identified students entering calculus that were at risk of not succeeding. And then Harvard implemented interventions, very small scale seminars, to train up these students so that they get back on track and then have the same time to degree as other students. However, that work was really unscalable. They have small class sizes, and these seminars with these interventions were extremely expensive. So Caroline and her work at Harvard found a way to basically carve out half of these students and put them in like a 50-person remedial workshop rather than in these 10-person seminars. And in this way, significantly saved money at Harvard instead of running all of these small seminars. She found a way to take a large cohort of these underprepared students and still make them successful. But now she's became McMaster with student sizes of like 1,000 to 1,500 students. And she wants to find a way to scale what she did previously. What did she do previously? She basically met with students in the first week or prior to the first week of class at the blackboard and talked with them. And took notes on what they said. Asked them, well, how did you think about that problem? How did you think, why is the slope like that? These were mostly pre-calculus conversations. And she tried to ascertain if the students really had the prerequisite knowledge to be successful or not. And if they didn't, then she would promote them into one of these interventions. How can we do that? We can't meet with 1,500 students in August before the September start of class. So we had some ideas, and this team has formed a strategy which kind of goes like this. We use some data at the beginning, we gather data at the beginning of class to build what I'm starting to call as a baseball card for each student. So we measure the student's capacity in pre-calculus by giving them a multiple choice calculus baseline assessment. It's basically measuring, do you know pre-calculus? And that should be CBA, but I wrote CPA because I was thinking about tax. My bad. And then in between each of these multiple choice prompts, we have a generic prompt, which is like, explain your reasoning. How did you think about that problem? And then students write text. So it's multiple choice question. How did you think about that? Multiple choice question. How did you think about that? And then we analyze this collection of text responses from students using natural language processing and machine learning to try to understand the voice of student at scale. This second step is what I think is really novel in our study. The other two, the ATMI is standard assessment in mathematics, and the CBA is based on prior work by other authors, notably Carlson, in measuring pre-calculus assessment. But we capture this new information with natural language processing and machine learning, and all of this is implemented with scalable technology using the Crowdmark platform. And the results are interesting. By combining these three data inputs, we have found that we have a better predictor of term test 1 and final exam performance than we have on any one of the individuals. So it's better than the CBA alone. It's better than the ATMI alone. This voice of student information improves our predictive power. So now, at scale, we have a way to begin to understand students, and we can predict with some confidence how well they're going to do on the final exam. But what was very interesting and emergent was that the data that we have gathered in the voice of student dimension allows us to cluster students into groups of archetypes that explain something about their learning styles and their approaches to learning. And with these changes, we can now just not speak to the individual student based on her baseball card, but we can kind of think of that student as similar to another subset of students that have this way of thinking about mathematics that's different from this other group of students that's thinking differently. And I'll show you a little bit about that. So these are radar plots along some dimensions: mathematical language, visualization, contextual reasoning, heuristic view, and a quantified score on their final exam. These different dimensions are capturing kind of the ways that they think. So visualization, evidence in their text that they're using Desmos, or that they're using graphing calculators and using the interaction with graphing capability, that would mean that this student is displaying an interest in this visualization way of thinking. Heuristics might be arguing about, this thing can't be infinity, it can't be zero, using more heuristic arguments. And what we've done in the NLP is find ways to classify what the students have written in text using these different dimensions. So that's one of the clusters that shows up. These students are not relying on visualization so much, not relying on Desmos, let's say, and they're scoring extremely well. Another cohort, very heavily relying on visualization, and then a fourth cohort. And here's all of the cohorts together. So the data emerged to allow us to think about different kinds of students in our classes, and then tailor instruction to these different cohorts that have emerged with data. And it's really early days, and this data is like weeks old, so I don't have the full story, but we are seeing something that involves a way that we can scale what Caroline had been doing previously, and also provide some pedagogical insights that describe different kinds of interventions based on the way that the student has displayed their attitudes, the way they've described their methods of reasoning, and their skill on the calculus baseline assessment. And that's just a kind of expanded view of the 5 different dimensions. So at Crowdmark, we are trying to find ways to allow the voice of students individually to be coalesced, grouped together, and the class can speak, maybe in different notes in harmony, but the class can speak with different notes, but in concert, so that we can listen to the students at scale and then engage in this dialogue in new ways. And this work complements what we've already done by adding things like the comment library, the repeatable way to add comments, the ability to capture scores. All those productivity gains are fabulous, but we can complement that gain in productivity with these other developments around AI and machine learning. And this is the first step, a contribution in the direction. But the larger call to action that I have for all of you as educators is, we do something really vital. We are the people that are trying to help the next generation survive. And that's a big call to action. And I think we need to imagine what our role is with more power and more creativity than doing exactly what the administrators told us to do, or exactly what the governor may have told us to do. We are vital to society, and we have to be able to innovate, especially given the challenges that we face as a society.